If you're joining us, please do take a seat. We want the more the merrier, basically, for these sessions. Welcome to the Masterclass Theatre. My name's Dave Guest. I'll be guiding you through proceedings here. And you hardly need me to tell you that these are uncertain times for the bus and coach industry. We've already seen franchising arrangements cropping up in places like Greater Manchester, and more of the same seems likely with the new government now installed. So during this session, Adam Leishman, the founder and executive chairman of the Ascendal Group, will compare and contrast bus contracting structures in London, Singapore and Hong Kong, three cities with very different contracting models. He's had experience of all three and will consider the positives and negatives of each. Now, Adam tells me his presentations aren't the normal kind of corporate thing. You will need to concentrate, not you wouldn't, of course, but you will need to concentrate on the images and on what he's saying. So put your phones away for just the next half hour or so. I'm giving you full attention. Please welcome Adam Leishman.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Great to be here. So today we are going to take a bit of a journey, because I think it's important to ask, what are the secret ingredients when it comes to bus franchising, or when it comes to buses in general? I think the previous talk, if anyone was here, was fantastic about setting the scene about the importance of buses in our industry. But the question is, how do we set the optimal governance structures in place to get those outcomes delivered? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Bring a bit of the international experience. The UK very much moving towards franchising at the moment. So what can we learn on the international arena where this has been happening for several decades now? So who am I and why would you be interested in what I have to say?
I'm from three generations of transport operators from Australia. My grandfather, my father, 50 years. I remember as a kid going to the depot and seeing the buses, the drivers, the mechanics, talking to them. To be honest, it's really in my blood. And after a career in finance and accounting, I decided to join the family business. I then helped grow it into one of Australia's top transport operators. It's now listed on the Australian stock market. It's in 4 continents. In 2013, I led the acquisition of part of First Group's London bus operation. Moving to London to run Tower Transit really changed my life. I realised what an amazing responsibility it was to be part of keeping London moving. Literally millions of people each day relying on us, as well as to care for 1,000 people that work for me and their families. London really sets the benchmark for public transport excellence, and it was both humbling and inspiring to be a part of it. I really learned so much during that time. And then in 2016, something really amazing happened. We were successful in winning the first international bus contract in Singapore, where we were able to bring all of what I'd learned in London and Australia before that to help transform transportation in Singapore. This is what really inspired me to dedicate my career to helping transform cities, and why I set up Ascendal. In 2018, I sold my stake in Tower Transit to establish Ascendal, with a vision of bringing cities to life through public transport. I genuinely believed London was such a good role model for other cities and wanted to share what I'd learned. Since then, I've spent many hours advising cities all over the world on how to improve their systems, from governance, network planning, new technology, financial structuring, real estate, urban development planning, and much more. In 2020, I partnered with Temple Water to purchase Citybus. We move about 1 million people in Hong Kong every day, which is just staggering to me, on 1,700 buses, thanks to the efforts of our 5,000 people strong workforce. I'm actually sitting in our depot here in Chai Wan, which is a 7-story bus garage. In the last 10 years, I've actually moved about 1.8 billion people across my businesses, mostly actually on double-deck buses. 55% of the world's population lives in cities. And we're facing many challenges, from pollution, poverty, crime, environment, equality, the list goes on and on. Health, economic development, housing, accessibility challenges. But there's one thing that's constant, and that is that excellence in public transport can help with all of these. It's why I've dedicated my career to making cities a better place for all the people that live in them. It's about serving the people in the industry and in the community. There are not many more important or fulfilling things to do. It's imperative that cities like London, Singapore and Hong Kong continue to show the world what is possible when it comes to public transport. I'm really proud that I've been a part of that, and I'm a passionate advocate for public transport and will continue to be. It's really exciting. I think we offer so much to the people that live in the cities in this world.
So that's who I am. Actually, if you look at the dots on the map, I've had experience in all of those locations with regards to franchising, bus contracting, either advising or bidding on tenders. I've had operations in Australia, London, currently still running buses in Cambridge, a 105-year-old business, Whippet, in Singapore, Hong Kong more recently, Chile, and the US. So I've got a bit of a broad understanding of how bus contracting works around the world, and I think there's so many different options, and I think it's important to learn from some of these other places. And that's why in 2016, when we first came to London, we're actually very pro-franchising, have been for over 15 years. And we organised a number of events back then in London to help the industry understand what franchising is, the benefits, the lessons learned from other markets. So it's actually really pleasing and exciting for me to now stand on this stage as our industry is about to transform towards franchising. And I know a lot of people have been negative about that. A lot of people have misconceptions perhaps. And I would like to share a little bit about my experiences, specifically in London, Singapore, and Hong Kong. But first of all, I think the previous speaker was right on talking about the importance of buses in our cities, and particularly, I think he used the phrase, cars being the enemy, and I 100% agree with that. But I want to take it to another level. 55% of the world's population live in cities, and what are some of the problems we're facing in cities the world over? In fact, do you know, we work in one of the most exciting industries in the world, because name me one industry that can help with almost every problem that cities are facing in the world today. Name me one industry. It's very hard because there's not really a silver bullet that tackles all of those issues. However, the bus does. The bus does. If you look at all of the issues we face and you look at the stats, the public transport industry can help with most of those things. And I think we need to get that narrative out there. We need to promote our industry much more rather than just within our industry. So in my experience around the world, one of the problems we face in our industry with governance is it's either too lopsided towards the private sector or it's too lopsided towards the public sector. But actually both sectors bring something to the table. And the best models are the ones where we get the most out of both sectors, the public and the private sector. The public sector is so good at some things, particularly around policy. They can bring infrastructure projects the private sector can't. They can look at a macro level at cities where private sector might have one element of that. But the private sector brings efficiency and innovation and ability to manage costs. And so these things, if they're brought together, is where true synergy occurs. And I think when we're talking about bus contracting, we need to be thinking at a high level, how can we get the most out of both sectors, and how can we put the risks on the side of the sector that can manage those risks best. For example, in Hong Kong, we had 100% commercial risk, but the government signed off on fare increases. And so there was a misalignment of risk-reward, and that caused tension, and it caused a focus on issues instead of what we should have been doing. That's just one example. So let's look at London. London, I think most people are very familiar with London, so I won't spend too much time talking about it. But the buses are owned by the operator, the depots are mostly owned by the operator. The government provides the infrastructure, the network planning, the marketing, the contract structure. It's competitively tendered on a route basis, 5 plus 2 year contracts. The government specifies the way to manage that to the iBus system, which there's a lot of targets and incentives set based on that performance. And we saw tremendous results when that was first brought in. From a performance bond perspective, there's an unlimited parent company guarantee, which, depending on if something goes wrong, can be very costly and means it's very hard to exit London if you have problems. Tender evaluation, mostly on price these days, and marketing led by the government. That's a very quick snapshot on the London system. It's very mature. It delivered fantastic results over the years. Perhaps at the moment going through reinvention of itself. Singapore started a new model about 10 years ago, which I happen to be heavily involved in, winning the first contract there. It's also a 5-year gross cost franchise model, but instead of bidding on individual routes, it's bidding on a package of routes that are attached to a depot. The buses and the depots are owned by the government, which means many companies can bid with a very level playing field. The bus stops, the infrastructure, the network planning, the marketing is all led by the government. The packages are competitively tendered, as I said, on a bundle of routes. The system, similar to London, the iBus system, to manage the routes, performance-driven. And the incentives, yes, there's headways through the EWT system, but there's also a basket of KPIs that also have financial rewards and disincentives linked to them as well. Performance bond is a percentage of the contract value that you need to provide as part of the bid. It's not huge, but it's not small either, because the thinking is if you are not performing, you can be replaced with another operator because the assets are there. It's not controlled by the private sector. The tender evaluation is interesting. It's actually 50-50 price quality. So when we first won in 2015, we were third cheapest. There were two very credible companies that were much cheaper than us, but when they looked at the overall package and what we offered, there was a lot of weighting towards quality and innovation. So we were able to win that first package, and in the end, the government was very happy with how things went. As I mentioned, the marketing's government-led. So then more recently, I've been involved in Hong Kong. The last 4 years, I've been leading Citybus in Hong Kong, which has been an extraordinary experience, moving 1 million people a day. But an extremely different model, much more based on the UK regional or non-franchised model of the past. In fact, a lot in Hong Kong was based on the UK, just not much changed in the last 30 years. So 10-year franchises in the more truer sense of the term franchise, more of a license actually, where we had 100% commercial risk. So we lived and died by the fare box. In fact, I think it's probably one of the only systems in the world, I see Lawrence here from Hong Kong, one of the only systems in the world today that is not subsidized. And that's a scary thought, particularly when we bought that business in 2020 in the middle of COVID. So there were some few sleepless nights, I can tell you. But the fleet is privately owned. The depots are privately controlled. There's a bit of a history there. I won't go off scope, but happy to talk to people later about it if they're interested. The bus stops are actually all owned by the private operator. So I had full control of all of my bus stops, all of the marketing. I was almost an operator and a semi-PTA, actually. I had a lot of the traditional government functions were on my side, and the government performed more of a gatekeeping role, although very, very hands-on. So it was hard to get things done because there was a lot of restrictions, let's say. There was no tender process, fully negotiated. So there was a lot of restrictions put in place to stop us from increasing fares. We had to get the chief executive and parliament to sign off on fare increases, as I touched on before. Any change in services, we had to get signed off. So whilst the risk sat with us, it was really kind of semi-regulated, or quite regulated actually. The systems in place were all driven by ourselves as the operator, and there really wasn't many incentives or penalties in place at all, which kind of created a bit of lethargy within the industry. When we turned up, there was quite an inefficient business we took over, and there wasn't really a lot of incentive to change much. And the way the fare structure worked, that necessitated that. So we had to do a lot of transformation within the business. No performance bonding, tender valuation negotiated, like I mentioned, and marketing operator-led. So what's the result of all of that? London, I would say, is very mature. There was a lot of change when the headway incentives came in, and the private sector is very easy to control. Just affect their bottom line, and you're going to influence outcomes. There's a very high barrier to entry to London because of the depot ownership structure, and there's very much a focus on headways and cost management. In Singapore, relatively new in the scheme of things, 10 years, but becoming more mature. Very good value for money assessment on bids. Partnership models driven a lot of innovation from the private sector as well as the government. It's encouraged the private sector to be innovative, highly competitive, and a focus on quality and cost management. In Hong Kong, the strong focus on financial viability. You're really focused on fares and ridership. That's kind of the bottom line for you as an operator. Very subjective performance analysis because there weren't any set guidelines or data management, let's say, and quite high barriers to entry, almost impossible for a new operator to enter that market. So what are the lessons that I take away from those experiences, having spent the last 10 years basically running businesses in each of those three markets? One of the things I would say to authorities is, don't just make it a game for the big guys. You know, there's lots of little guys that can offer a lot to the industry, and we need to make sure they have a fair chance as well as the big guy. You know, if we had a really big balance sheet requirement and a high performance bond in Singapore, our company at the time would never have been successful. And yet we probably were able to bring more innovation than just about anyone else at that time. So I think you need to be very careful to encourage all different types of bidders. And a lot of that comes down to asset ownership, being able to take away that incumbency advantage so you can open up the market to new opportunities. And one thing I would say is, the rural operations in the UK and the metropolitan operations are extremely different. And I think you need to approach them very differently. They're different types of operations, and I think it's a big risk to bring those two things together without some serious consideration on how to do that. And there's many different ways to do that, but I think you need to realize the benefits the smaller operators bring, particularly in the rural areas where they're super connected to. I love this picture. One thing I would say, you really need to look at leveling the playing field. Don't make it a huge advantage to the incumbent operator. Asset ownership, buses, depots, and information is critical. Those three things are critical to leveling the playing field. Depot ownership, like I touched on. In Singapore, very interesting model. They bought all of the depots. They bought all of the buses. And so after 5 years, or even before that, if an operator is not performing, but after 5 years, if there's a new tender and someone's offering a better service, you can just switch one operator in and the other one out. So you don't need big performance bonds, you don't need big balance sheets. If there's non-performance, you just switch one in, the other one goes out. And that really opens up the door to different types of bidders, and same with the buses. I think that's a very good model. I know it's not always possible to transition to that because of the challenges of the legacy systems in place. I saw that in Sydney a few years ago, where there was a two-tier transition where they negotiated a deal with the incumbents where if you signed up to hand over your assets on a reasonable terms, you would get an automatic contract in place for X years. And if you didn't sign up, you would go straight out to tender. So there's some innovative things that you can do along those lines. But when your assessment, I would strongly, if you get nothing else from my presentation today, please take this away. Don't just go for lowest cost bids. It's fraught with danger. And I've seen it time and time again in places in Australia, in Malta, in many other places in the world where cheapest bids are taken, and it ends up being more costly than what the bid looks like from the outset. And there's a case study in a place, Adelaide, one of the cities in Australia, where a company won a contract there that was an unsustainable bid. It was an unmitigated disaster. The political party lost the next election because of it, and it ended up costing them more than if they had have taken the second bidder's bid from the outset. So don't be mistaken by these cheap bids that end up blowing up in your face. Very tempting at the time, and very hard to justify not taking the cheapest bid, but please, please, please don't take the cheapest bid just because it's cheapest. Look at the full context of that bid. And one of the things that some of the top authorities do, and this happens in places like Perth and Singapore, the government will know what the cost roughly should be. They'll do a thing called shadow bidding, where they'll work out what the range of costs should be. And so when the bids come in, if anyone goes in below that range, straight in the bin. Avoid all of the hassle from the outset. These are some of the learning the hard way that I really hope you don't have to learn here in the UK by experiencing it yourself. One of the things I would say also extremely important, it's not just about the size of the company and the brand of the company. You're actually contracting with people that are going to be running your services in your local area. You need to know who those people are. You need to know they have a track record and they've got passion to deliver what's on the box. You don't want just a business development team that sends a bid in, that's in another location, has nothing to do with the bid, and you've got a brand that you're relying on. You need to have confidence that what's on the box is going to be delivered. I think that's a hugely important thing. And I think one of the biggest things you need to look at a high level is how do you create a partnership? You know, our industry has wasted too much time with conflict between the private operator and the public sector. You know, the beauty of tendering is you have a very competitive process, you have a winner, and then you put that behind you and you work together to deliver all of those fantastic things that we heard about in the previous presentation. And that's the concept that you need to think about. You're selecting a partner for the next 5 or 10 years. You're not selecting a supplier, you're selecting a partner. And that's the mindset that's going to transform not only our sector, but our cities. Private sector is very easy to control. It comes down to the back pocket. If you're savvy in how to structure contracts to incentivize the private sector through a reward and penalty structure and the threat of losing a contract, you will get the outcomes you want. So I think franchising and tendering enables this. I've got a cheeky clause up there. Government's job is to harness private greed for public profit. And you know, maybe some will argue with me, but at the end of the day, I think the private sector is pretty easy to control with some smart contracting. And then together, you can achieve the collective targets, right? So the trick is, you know, where things fall apart in contracts around the world, like I was touching on before, and some of the misalignment of incentives in Hong Kong, is where the incentives are different. Take that example with the fares in Hong Kong. Politically, you don't want to put fares up because there's an affordability issue, there's a voting issue, you don't want to be perceived that, oh, the fares are going up. But as an operator, my livelihood depends on that. And there's only so much you can do to cut costs. You do need to have fares to cover unless you're going to be subsidised. So it's one or the other, subsidise or put the fares up. But there's a misalignment of interests. So it creates tension and conflict, and you waste a lot of time. But what you need to focus on is bringing those alignment of interest together so that you can focus on hitting the targets. But you need to define what those targets are. What is it that's important to your city? Is it headways like London have made a huge impact when they brought in the EWT system? Or is it customer experience? Or is it maintenance standards? Or is it on-time running? First, last buses like Singapore does, a basket of goods. You need to be able to very clearly define what's important to you and then set up a regime that tackles those issues. And then actually you can be looking at the bigger picture, where you're collectively trying to improve the livability of your city for the people that are living there. And that's what we should be doing. Going back to the start of my presentation, actually, the impact we can make in our cities is dramatic. And we should not underestimate that. We are the silver bullet to fixing so many problems our cities face. And the previous speaker was talking about some of those problems. I couldn't agree more. Actually, the public sector, if they're getting benefit under a gross cost contract, for example, with more ridership, more people catching the bus, then they're incentivized to put more right-of-way for buses. So actually then everyone benefits and the city improves its livability. Because you look at a place like Singapore, and they were very frustrated up to 2016 with an industry that wasn't investing, the buses looked tired and dirty, there wasn't the ridership that they wanted, and they changed to this model, created this partnership, really got the best out of both worlds, and the city's transformed in the last 10 years. Tremendously transformed. And I felt such a privilege to be a part of that because I saw how a city, even with a good public transport system, could change so dramatically with smart contracting. So that's my challenge to you. Obviously, I can talk for days on this topic. It's my passion. But, at the end of the day, this is what we're here for. So I would encourage you to give it your best shot, to get the best out of both sectors, and to really, deliver something that's exceptional in your city. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Adam. You outlined 3 considerably different approaches there, and if I was to say to you, is any one of them the one you would recommend, would you say there is one, or it's an amalgam of the best bits from all 3?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think there's one size fits all. I think you really need to look at your city, your region, and work out what is it your objective is. What do you want to get to? What are your constraints, your restrictions and opportunities? And how do you define that in a way to get the best outcomes? I've got to say, experiencing the Singapore transformation, London and Hong Kong are both good in their own right. They've both had a lot of success. They've been around for a long time. Singapore transitioned from one model to another. They're actually quite similar to Hong Kong, and then they transitioned to a model quite similar to London. In fact, they used London and Perth in Australia as their 2 kind of sample cities that they wanted to base their structure on. But that was after a lot of studies and working out what they wanted in Singapore, and the transformation was dramatic. So I would definitely say look at what Singapore achieved, but I would say don't just copy that. You've got to understand your market and what you're trying to achieve.
I was going to say that sort of transition would be as big here if we were to attempt that there. Anybody got any questions? Yes. To you first.
Hi. Oh, okay. So I was intrigued by, you mentioned depot ownership, infrastructure and information. I was intrigued on the information, what information, who collects it and for what purpose?
Yeah, so we often talk about bus ownership and depot ownership and incumbency advantage if they're owning the assets and the tender doesn't give access to those assets. And that's obvious and easy to understand. There's also another advantage with information around ridership, around the data, around the schedules and the on-time running. So if you're going to bid on a large package and you need to schedule and roster your team for the most efficient cost system and you don't have transparent information, then it becomes quite a disadvantage. So and this is a trick operators play. I'm an operator, I know how it works. So an operator will try to protect and guard as much of that information as possible and make it hard for the other operators, and maybe even put some dummy information out there that's not entirely correct. So as an authority, the more information you can collect in the early days and the more transparency you can offer to the operator, then you're leveling the playing field.
Picking up on the observation about not making it just for the big guys, are you going back to the future to implement what Mrs. Thatcher and Nicholas Ridley actually had in mind, which was many small operators that would service our communities in accordance with the 1986 Transport Act? So are you the natural successor to Nicholas Ridley and Mrs. Thatcher?
You told me you were going to ask me a hard question. Look, I know there's a lot of fear with the small and medium operators in the UK right now, and I think it would be a tragedy to lose what they bring to the industry. And I think, like I said in the presentation, they're so connected to the local communities. There's a genuine care for those local communities. And I think we need to be very careful that we don't just do a big corporatization experience with this tendering. And so I think a lot of thought needs to be given to how you either tender on a smaller scale, or if you want to combine it with some of the larger tenders, you can do things like require a larger bidder to have smaller subcontractors in place that have local connections. There's a number of things that you can do. But going back to the first question, it's horses for courses. You don't want to just take the Singapore model and put it into a region that's a rural area in the UK. It's very different. And I think the standards are different in operation. The cost is different if you have a local operator versus a big operator. And I think we need to celebrate those differences and do the contracting in a way that ensures, we don't become sterile. And if you look at the rail industry in the UK, how that's evolved over the years, when the tendering first came out, there were a lot of bidders, and there were a lot of smaller, medium-sized bidders, and there was a lot of innovation and a lot of things achieved. And then over time, what happened? You ended up having less and less number of bidders. The cost of bidding became more and more expensive. That's another issue, actually. Don't make these crazy expensive bids that make it really hard for anyone except the big companies to bid. You don't need 3,000 pages of documents to assess a bid. You don't need all of the policies and everything. So, yeah, I would hope that we don't lose that richness that's currently in the industry.
Okay, one very quick question, please, and very quick answer.
I have two questions.
Oh, sorry, you've got one question.
One question, which of the three is the most profitable? And secondly, they have very different attitudes to car, don't they? Singapore is very anti-car, Hong Kong is less anti-car, and London is even less anti-car.
That sounded like two questions, but anyway,
okay,
which is more profitable?
Let's say they're connected. I think that is a very good question. Well, London at the moment, most operators are losing money, and I think that's totally unsustainable, not healthy at all for anyone. Singapore, operators are making money, but not a lot. It's fair, it's balance. Hong Kong, you went from highly profitable bus services to, during COVID and mismanagement, to losing money. The company I was running, actually, we were just getting back to break even. We'd been losing money for 6 years. And I think that's a function of what the second point you made, that in Hong Kong, there's the fare issue I talked about, but there really has not been a war on cars, let's say, and there should be. And it was one of my biggest frustrations and what I was trying to fix. Singapore, absolutely. Very good what they're doing with their cars, congestion charging, and London as well. Thumbs up to that.
Okay.
But more bus priority we need.
Okay, Adam, I know you could go on for longer, but unfortunately, time has run out. Adam Leishman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.